बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया यहाँ पे दावत देने के लिए। मौलाना आज़ाद नेशनल उर्दू यूनिवर्सिटी और हमारे डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ सोशियोलॉजी के साथी, the students who are here, as well as I see many of my JNU friends and colleagues from Maulana Azad National University, and extremely grateful for your presence here. This is a book, मैं कोशिश करूँगा कि मिक्स ज़बान में बोलूँ. This is a book which was written out of certain kind of an angst and anxiety. The angst was not what is happening in and around us, which of course was creating huge anger as well as, disturbing the minds of any reflective thinker. But more than that, the anger or the angst was also about the silences around it, or deliberate kinds of obfuscations, certain kind of obfuscations which you see, deliberate kind of confusions to be created, through play of vocabulary, through hiding behind disagreements, by seeing merits in certain kind of ploy of the state, despite the fact that we know how there is a singular focus insofar as Hindu nationalist rise is concerned on demonizing a particular kind of a community or group of communities. ये किताब जो है वो it's a compilation of different essays. Every essay documents the experience of the Muslims, particularly any segment of Muslim involved in its own particular profession or social location. But how does it come to interact with the state? How law and lawmaking make Muslim a particular kind of a Muslim which it wants to produce? Say, for example, the UAPA would like to, whether not literally, but more or less in practice, as the title of the book is, State in Practice. So more or less in practice, you would see that how UAPA, which is a law, a special law to address the terror question in India, comes to frame or stereotype those who are supposedly associated with terror-related activities with certain kind of classification features, reducing them to either their religious identity or, in the case of Mois, to the tribal identity, etc. So there are 5 different essays here. As I said, each of the essays document a specific experience. So, for example, the question of the foreigner in Assam. In 2019, the NRC final draft was published, and 1.9 million people, nearly 20 lakh log, through this whole tedious process which they went through, in which it was not just important whether, like you and anywhere else, what is the proof of our citizenship? We have our passport, we have our Aadhaar card, we have our voter ID list, I-card, etc. This is the proof of our citizenship. Despite possessing all these documents, you could still be a foreigner, because what was more important in the NRC case was that you have to also prove that your ancestors were also citizens of India. You had to prove, despite all your educational records, all your employment records, etc., that there were a set of documents which were called legacy documents, that the name of your ancestors figured in those legacy documents. And not only that their names figured, but you have to also prove that they were your ancestors. If, say, for example, a person who says, Mr. Shahnawaz Ali was my grandfather, and his name is there in the 1951 NRC or later on in the 1961 electoral rolls, that proves that I am not a foreigner, I am an Indian citizen. The other person also claims that that name, Mr. Shahnawaz Ali, was his name of my grandfather rather than anyone else's. Now, both of you are under the suspect category and probably can go into the detention camp. Think about it, that in a country like this, where documentation is, not easy to maintain, not easy to acquire, that populations, particularly poor populations, are constantly migrating, no stability of home, occupation, etc. And to maintain such kind of documents, and as well as they were asked to go through this exercise multiple times, 1.9 million people are today in a sort of a situation in which they're virtually stateless. And how did this come about? The Supreme Court played the role of the executive. If you have any question on NRC, where will you go to? Because the Supreme Court is itself leading the whole NRC exercise under the previous Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi, who wanted to emerge as a SME's hero. Well, that was one. So one chapter of it goes into the history of the entire foreigner question in Assam, and observes how the whole category foreigner, through an interplay of politics and socio-cultural processes, is essentially a production produced over a period of time, and now is the target of the chauvinist Assamese nationalism. There are some who are seen as external, there are some excluded, there are some included, depending on their relationship in this kind of a framework. One of the chapters also looks into Article 341 of the Indian Constitution. इस आर्टिकल 341 के तहत शेड्यूल कास्ट रिजर्वेशन was extended to former untouchable castes, and there's a whole list provided also. But in that Article 341 is also attached Clause 3, where the presidential order says that this provision is only for those practitioners of Hinduism. As a result, by now we are familiar, and courts are also very well aware, that there is a caste system which exists across religious groups in India. Despite the ideological kind of a difference or ritual kind of a difference, but irrespective of it, social practices, insofar as concerned, it affects all followers of all faiths in India, including those which rebelled against Brahminism and emerged and had a very casteless kind of a doctrine, such as Sikhism, Jainism, or so on. And similarly, we see that despite Islam's egalitarian philosophy, we see that in practice, the caste system prevails. Now, what this provision does is that those who are having similar traditional occupation as that of the caste untouchables amongst the followers of Hinduism, say for example the Bhangis in UP, many of them would be Muslims. There are similarly many such caste groups, not only amongst Muslims but even amongst the Christians. All of them, irrespective of the caste discrimination which they might face from the rest of the society because of the impure, quote unquote, impure traditional occupation which they had, they're denied the benefits of the same provision which the brethren are otherwise, allowed. The courts, the people have approached the courts, and the courts have remained steadfast, declining them that status. But there are interesting cases as well which we observed. एक केस मैं बताता हूँ, केरला से केपी मनु साहब का केस है. केपी मनु साहब केरला के एक अनटचेबल कास्ट है पुलाया. उनके ग्रैंडफादर और ग्रेट ग्रैंडफादर many generations ago converted into Christianity. KP Manu was born a Christian, was practicing Christianity. But to get a government position, as he belongs to the Pulaya caste, he claimed SC status, and he got it, he secured it. However, there was a complaint, there was a inquiry, and it was found that he is a practitioner of Christianity, and Christians are denied that status. So, when it reached the court, so that thing was withdrawn from him. He could no longer remain in government employment. He approached the court, arguing that before seeking a government job, I had converted back into Hinduism. Right. So now I should be given the status. Think about it. Many generations ago, his family had converted into Christianity. Mr. Manu, up till now a Christian, claimed a SC status. The courts, the Supreme Court, in all other cases where those who are untouchables and followers of a different faith have claimed SC status, have been denied. But here KP Manu plays a trick. He says that I'm reverting back to Hinduism. And the court argues that as long as Mr. Manu and his family were practitioners of Christianity, their caste was eclipsed. ठीक है, जैसे सूर्य ग्रहण लगता है तो उसमें भी ग्रहण लग गया था कास्ट के ऊपर. जैसे ही वो हिंदुइज्म में वापस आए हैं, अब वो फिर से पुलाया हो गए हैं, फिर से अनटचेबल हो गए, फिर से वो जो है caste has come back to him, and hence he can be accorded the SC status. This, what you can say, is a court-sanctioned project of Ghar Wapsi. We know whose political program Ghar Wapsi is all about. There are several such cases. This chapter goes into the history of the whole SC category, how it evolved, and how this provision came into being, and how have the courts adjudicated on that. There's an chapter which we in this book on the question of impunity. The question of impunity here looks into how mass killings, cases of collective violence are innumerable in India. Basically, the marginal communities, whether sections sections of Muslims or lower caste, etc., have suffered it. My research on the caste killings in Bihar, which is ongoing, also comes along the same kind of conclusion. Okay, when it comes to violence against those who are the communities on the margin, impunity is built into the political structure. This impunity I have tried to study through Bhagalpur Riots Inquiry Commission report in this book. 1989, there was massive communal violence in Bhagalpur. The violence began with, the Sangh Parivar Vishwa Hindu Parishad led Ram Shila Yatra, which was about the Ram Janambhumi campaign. That in order to massively mobilize around that and build a certain kind of a Hindu unity, the plan was to bring one brick from every village to contribute to the building of the temple. I don't know if those bricks have finally ended up, whether they were actually used in the construction of the new temple or not, but they definitely led to huge violence in many places. This, brick from every village would be brought in a extremely aggressive kind of a procession. They will all converge into district headquarters and result in even further polarization, etc. Something similar happened in Bhagalpur. As it went through particular areas where Muslim populations were there were skirmishes, there were conflicts, and there were ultimately massive violence. In this massive violence, I think the official records do say that not less than 900 to 1,000 people were killed. It went on for at least 2 months. Infamous cases are there that how people were massacred and the bodies buried under the field over which cauliflower was cultivated. The reason why some determined civil servant who was later transferred got suspicious was that the cauliflower in that particular field compared to the adjoining areas was highly productive. It was like the growth was huge, and he went into further investigation and discovered that there were bodies buried under it. So that is how that is the extent of brutality which Bhagalpur witnessed. In the backdrop of that, following it, this is interesting that in India, following every up till now, before the Delhi riots, I can say that every instant of massive violence was followed up by the institution of a commission of inquiry. The commission of an inquiry by a sitting judge or a former judge, some well-known people, would look into the totality of the situation, why violence took place, what led to this violence. Blom Hansen has an interesting thesis on this. Tom Blom Hansen. His work on the Bombay riots of 1992 shows that amongst the people, particularly those populations who suffered violence, the state is constituted, or cultural constitution of the state, which means how it is seen as, how it is understood as, what is based on their own experience of the state and its agencies. तो एक तो sublime, the state को बड़ा अच्छा माना गया, justice का center है, it will deliver justice, it is neutral, etc. So there is a sublime construction of the state. There is also a profane construction of the state. The state both brutal hai, police, everyday violence, etc., etc. Now, what is interesting is that Blomhansen discovered that the profane construction of the state as brutal, was a routine experience of the people. That these are vulnerable communities, slum dwellers, etc. और वहाँ पे आपको देखिए कि पुलिस जो है उसका रोल completely different होता है. Even if they go approach a government hospital, the whole, the way in which they receive the treatment, etc., is completely different from those who are better class backgrounds who reach there. So this is a sort of a routine violence which they face, and built on that experience, they see state as something which is not necessarily a source of justice or neutrality, etc. In periods of violence, because of the partisan action of the police and the other state officials, this profane, idea of the state multiplies. But this is also the moment in which the state wishes to reclaim its legitimacy. Legitimacy का उर्दू वर्ड शायद मैं जी जावाज ना, तो वो अगर उन if they want to rebuild the morality जिसके around state exists, it immediately institutes commissions of inquiry, etc., to showcase that it is a secular state, that is a neutral state, that it cares for everyone. However, the results of inquiries, we know, have ultimately ended up, ठंडे बस्ते में जिसको कहते हैं, उसी में लगे रह गए. The Bhagalpur Riots Inquiry Commission report has a very interesting history. That it stands as the only inquiry commission which ended up with two different reports, completely, entirely opposite to each other. The chairperson of the commission gave one report, which went all along in support of the police as well as the Hindu organizations there, particularly the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and others. It ultimately ended up blaming those who were the victims of violence for the violence itself. Whereas the members' report was completely opposed to it. In this kind of a obfuscation of truth, etc., what we also observe is the way in which impunity is produced. That Bhagalpur, of the 900 odd cases, hardly 450 were recorded in FIRs, in which most of them were against unknown people, so no one could be prosecuted. Most FIRs were delayed, so as soon as they reached the state, reached the courts could raise questions about such delayed FIRs, and as a result, they could also not reach up to the trial state. Some cases which reached the trial, and one or two odd cases where there was also certain kind of a punishment or something, but from the higher court they were also acquitted. So as of now, largely, despite officially recorded 900 plus cases of killings, there is no person who did it. So we don't know who were the killers, although it is a public knowledge. Impunity is not accidental, but inbuilt. as we observe large number of cases, and a similar kind of a practice is observed, right from the lower court to the lower levels of the bureaucracy, as well as the police administration, to its highest, corridors. This is exactly the case which I noticed when I was doing field work in Lakshmanpur Bathe, which was a village in 1997, attacked by the Ranveer Sena, and 58 to 60 people were killed, extremely poor, and brutally killed. Most of them were women and children. And when I visited, it was 20 years later, but just a year after, almost all of the perpetrators were acquitted by the court. And the reasons for it was something similar. FIRs were not properly recorded, that even if eyewitnesses took huge risk upon themselves, these are people with insecure occupations, hardly any guarantee of state security, etc. But they traveled all the way from, very frequently from the village to Patna and other places, so that justice could be delivered. They volunteered to become eyewitnesses, and despite all those, ultimately the cases were lost. So, with this as an example, I go into the history of the entire process of how impunity has been produced. What is interesting is that in the studies of communal violence, if you go into the historians and their study of the genesis of communal violence in the colonial period, you will see a lot of studies focused on how the state and its role in colonial states' role in the production of violence. That how it divided emperor, the nationalist historiographers would say, divide and rule policy of the state. There are also other kinds of historians and others who looked at colonial state apparatus, census, etc., which has created communities, fixed boundaries, and so on. But when it comes to the post-independence period, the gaze, the scholarly gaze on the state has completely vanished. So those who are studying communal violence have studied, organizations which are of communal orientation. They have studied political economy of communal violence. But the state, more or less, has escaped their attention, except for some recent scholarship, such as that of Paul Brass, where Paul Brass talks about the institutionalized riot system. That is something kind of a lacuna. And when it comes to impunity, it has actually not been really, studied at all. And this is, of course, a question which future researchers who are interested in the field, I would like to draw their attention towards. Those who are interested in studying collective violence and association of state with it. There's an interesting case here. Also, one of the chapters looks into, to understand Ayodhya and the verdict on Ayodhya. I go back into the colonial period and try to study one dispute of somewhat, not exactly like that. The dispute was on the Shahidganj Mosque in Lahore in the 1930s. Shahidganj was a name of a Gurudwara which existed there. And the Gurudwara came into existence on an area of, which was that of a mosque. In fact, the mosque also existed. But during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, it went into the possession of the Sikhs. When the British rule was restored or came into being, Muslim organizations appealed the courts that it be handed over to them because it originally belonged to them. The colonial states' approach on questions of interreligious dispute was ideologically completely different from that of the post-independent state, is what I'm trying to argue. It went into the litigations went on for a long time. There was also some amount of violence around it. But the tribunal ultimately handed over the premises as well as the mosque to the Sikhs, saying that they have been in possession of it for a long period of time. There were actually also Land Alienation Act and other kinds of acts which had come into being, which allowed that to happen. The Sikhs decided to demolish the mosque to build something else. The colonial, imperative was, then it seems, that to the extent possible, retain a localized issue, localized, rather than taking to a massive mobilizational kind of frame. Secondly, to maintain status quo. So, if the Sikhs were in possession of it, let it be them in possession. Otherwise, it will create more problems than what it does. Public order was then, our maintenance of public order was then the priority. And this you will see in many of the similar interreligious disputes on various questions. However, with the post-independence period, this kind of priority of the courts as well as the administration seems to have changed. It began to be guided by more of a majoritarian impulse and imperative. And this is revealed in many cases, even the Bodh Gaya case as well, where the Buddhists wanted to retain possession of the Bodh Gaya temple, but they have constantly been denied of that. Compare it with the Babri Mosque adjudication and the way in which it was finally done. It was through the forceful, might of right kind of a framework which seemed to have worked. The courts argued that yes, there was no temple which existed beneath it. We have not found any historical evidence. The court did not go with the rationality of the property ownership, etc., as well. What it actually ultimately ended up is handing over the entire area to those who were otherwise seen by the court itself as having conducted a criminal act by demolishing the mosque. So that is a kind of a huge kind of a shift in priority which we can notice in the over a period of time if we historically try to study it. In a summation, how we see in these different kinds of encounters with the state and the law, that since the coming of the BJP or the current regime, 2014 onwards, we've been told that there is a new normal. This is a new normal and better adjust to it. And liberal scholars and commentators had tried to contrast it with the old idea of India. So idea of India, Sunil Khilnani's book itself, idea of India was that of a tolerant India which did not have, incidents of violence, etc. That it did not tolerate intolerance. That it was a sort of a happy coexistence, commingling of cultures, of traditions, of it, etc. Whereas there is a huge, completely new kind of a rupture which we see, where the coming of the new regime, you have a new normal, and in the new normal, there is an aggressive Hindutva, there is a demonization of communities, there is violence all around. My problem with this kind of formulation was that if the idea of India was so strong, that's so rooted, how did it unravel in no times? इतनी जल्दी वो collapse कैसे कर गया? अगर उसके जड़ें इतनी मजबूत थी और अगर वो ideologically वो हिंदुस्तान के tolerant tradition और tolerance का usually you will see whether it is the writing of Shashi Tharoor or even other scholars, they draw idea of tolerance from this whole thing about Hindu tolerance. So if that was the case, how did the same people become so intolerant? How did the institutions which emerged or were a reflection of our embodiment of this idea of India started falling apart or falling in line? This is what we see in this case of courts as well as the bureaucracy. So this requires a certain kind of a framework, studying of the present through an analysis of the past. So in every present also lies the past. The past and present is kind of a framework which we need to look at. All these works, therefore, rely less on ethnography and more in terms of method on study of documents. In fact, with this experience, I've also written a paper on history and historical method, where I argue that we need to have studied documents, but also need to separate documents of power, which emerges from state quarters, from personal documents, because documents of power have huge influence. They can make life, they can break livelihoods. So we need to be invested in history to understand what constitutes the social or the political. Within the discipline of sociology, I assume many of you are sociologists. We've been told very often that sociology is the study of the contemporary society. What sociology offers is certain kind of conceptual apparatus. And this conceptual apparatus its development will be incomplete if we don't take history into account as to how that phenomena came into being and what different kinds of forms it took in the past. Any idea of or any concept as such as caste, you cannot understand it in totality unless until you also see how it emerged in the past and what is the role it has played in various different situations as such. So one needs to be invested into history also to be able to understand the present. This book, through this book, I also am trying to. I might develop it later, but as of now, it is part of kind of some amount of attention which I've paid in the book to this whole idea of who constitutes the margin. If you take Muslim as a category, I come to argue that the whole idea of a Muslim is more externally produced than internally as it will come into being. Internally, Muslims are hugely diverse, that there is no singularity called this Muslim or that Muslim. It varies culturally, it varies in terms of caste, social hierarchy, classes, gender. There are also huge internal conflicts. When I was referring to the Assamese and how the Bangladeshis have been produced, there's a whole process of production of Bengali Muslims as Bangladeshi foreigners. The native Assamese Muslims are are more or less in agreement with the Assamese nationalists, so as to prove their, authentic nativism. Similarly, you would see when there is a chapter here on what is called the whole question of the sacred cow. You'll see that when it comes to question of beef and beef consumption, and very often Muslims are stigmatized as those who are beef consumers. Amongst Muslims themselves, there will be those who are upper class Muslims who would say, "Oh, this is not what we eat. These are poor Muslims eat." Passing it on to the others rather than owning it up, or rather than disputing that it is not necessarily just Muslims who eat it, and and so on. So these kinds of conflicts and these kinds of internal schisms are there, which sometimes are extremely pronounced as well. But how is a Muslim or a margin as a homogeneity is produced is through this triadic relationship in which this nation state is at the top, the national community, at one axis of this triangle, and the margin or the community in question on the other axis. The national community and the state are in a certain kind of a symbiotic relationship where every act of extra legality which the state would do, state too has its zones of legality and extra legality. All this bulldozer justice is being reframed as extra legal justice. Actually, it is illegal. Similarly, encounter killings, and with this strange category which might be found only in India, encounter specialists, and the whole celebration about encounter specialists in the Indian movies as well as the public at large tells us about this symbiosis between the national public and the excesses of the state. The margin is produced in this kind of a triadic relationship, which is where the national community and the state functionaries, state as an ideology, attribute certain kind of a homogeneity to communities so as to exterminate them or put them under certain kind of a classifications. So very often you will see some of the Hindutva spokesmen will say, "Oh, okay, all Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims." They might qualify it nowadays, will say most terrorists are Muslims. But without going into necessarily that intellectual investigation as to how a terrorist is produced, the whole category of terrorists. Today, when someone was mentioning Bhagat Singh earlier, and in colonial times, Bhagat Singh was seen as a terrorist by the colonial officials. Even some of the historians called them as revolutionary terrorists. I'm not condoning what terror networks or terror organizations would do, but I also see a huge process of how, you know, groups and communities are come to be labeled with certain kind of features, you know. So finally, I will conclude with by whole this idea about the state, the national community. By national public, I mean to say that this is you know, the public in the European sense is different from people. You know, people might be those who have a commonality of culture, same culture, say French are a people. But French become a public when they become rational, when they become political, when they become, you know, become active in certain civil society organizations, etc. So public is associated with rationality. But the national public, which I am referring to, had its origins in Indian case with the national movement. So यहाँ तो huge diversity है. It is not same as homogeneous French people. So national public emerged as a category through this national movement. It has constantly expanded to also introduce elites of different sections of the population. But this national public is not as rational as it is expected out to be, as the whole idea of the public is associated with. And deep down within it. ये नेशनल पब्लिक अलग अलग वक्त में इसका आइडियोलॉजिकल कैरेक्टर शिफ्ट कर सकता है इन टर्म्स ऑफ प्रायोरिटीज, but ultimately the state seeks its you know, legitimacy, its approval from the national public. So finally, I'll refer to one interesting incident many of you would come to know, and particularly I see Sahid here, who comes from that region. उनको शायद अच्छे से पता होगा कि 2017 के आसपास बड़े you know, I was reading a news report where the news reporter did an undercover kind of an operation. These kind of operations are very rare in, you know, Indian journalism practices. So undercover kind of an operation in the sense that he assumed a Muslim name, took a Muslim name for himself, and went around asking people in the new area of Haryana, those particularly you know, cart or etc., where they were selling biryani. उनसे उन्होंने जाके पूछा कि भाई आपकी बिरयानी में is it cow meat or buffalo meat? क्योंकि cow meat was of course banned. So and whereas buffalo meat was permissible. The vendors of course said कि no, it is buffalo meat. How can we have a cow meat? It is illegal. But he went on further probing. नहीं सच तो बता दीजिए थोड़ा, मुझे तो वही पसंद है. तो ultimately they revealed कि see, we go by the consumer taste, and consumer का preference तो cow meat ही है. अब इन्होंने national headline hit किया कि the biryanis in Nu are not of buffalo meat but cow meat. That was the national headline of one of the most leading, you know, media houses in this country. When Akhlaq, one of the first lynchings which took place in 2015 in Dadri area of UP, was killed by a frenzied mob, After a while, the attention shifted completely towards अखलाक के फ्रिज में क्या था. Fact of the matter, Akhlaq's house was raided. He was killed in front of his family, etc. The national discourse was on what was there in Akhlaq's fridge, whether it was beef or whether it was mutton. It was sent to some forensic lab to also find it out. And a third incident I will refer to is in terms of just explaining what this whole thing about national public I'm referring to is about a person somewhere in Punjab holding up a placard saying, "I want Khalistan," is immediately branded an anti-national. While you go through the 2014 election campaign in Bombay, one of the people, the campaign ran of the ruling regime, present ruling regime, ran that I am proud to be a Hindu nationalist. So, while the national public might be very difficult to define in tangible terms, but symbolically you can understand how it is constituted. Thank you.
What we find is that we find a new public coming up in post-independent India. Till now, or what we read in our university curriculum in debates, that Indian public was very secular, and that took long time for post-independent academia to convince academic and civil society that people in India are secular, they love syncretic culture. But then the moment you have change in the regime, through all these writings, including practices of the state by Prof. Tanweer, where you have stories of Bhagalpur, stories of mob lynching, and questions of NRC in Assam, we find indulgence of state brutally in terms of dehumanizing the whole idea of public. Second, how court becomes part of that, because court was the last sacrosanct space institution where even today all of us see that, और तमाम फिल्मी डायलॉग्स हमने हमेशा सुने हैं कि आपको कोर्ट में देखेंगे. That whole idea of seeking justice in the court is gradually declining. So the commission reports of, for example, Bhagalpur commissions, we have heard and read about how killings took place by the state machineries, but nothing happens. And is it that the state thinks that, or machinery of the state thinks that nothing will happen? There are several commissions after every violences, so that people are all thinking that when the state which is already giving a lot of impunity we are talking about, people are also thinking nothing will happen or kuch nahi hoga, and exactly that is happening in the last at least 1 decade. How do we look at this whole situation as a civil society, as a researcher, when we try to understand India as a secular state, India as a constitutional state, and India as a state where people elect the government? उसी में दूसरी बात यह है कि क्या इसमें कुछ और रिसर्च करने का स्कोप है, जब स्टेट, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन और सिविल सोसाइटी एक दूसरे से इतना ज़्यादा ट्रायड रिलेशनशिप में इंडल्ज है जो सेकुलर नोशंस को कमज़ोर कर रही है? तो इसमें नए रिसर्च क्या कर सकते हैं हम? डू वी हैव सम स्कोप टू डू इंक्वायरी इनटू दिस प्रोसेस?
Well, there are many questions which this book touches upon, but leaves it open for further research. As I said, one, of course, is the question of impunity itself. It has hardly been studied in the Indian context. How is this impunity brought about? When we talk about impunity as students of sociology, our apart from, we see the state as an institution of the society, isn't it? It is the social which, within which the political also can be found. And there is a close relationship with the social and the political. So, if the impunity is to be studied, it is not just the legal impunity which perpetrators get, but the way in which, if you see violence and post-violence, impunity seems to be inherent in the social structure itself. That those who are seen as perpetrators of violence may very often have emerged as national heroes or heroes of the areas. Studies on post-violence social life should also look into these aspects as to how do the victims of violence see these kinds of emerging situations as, what kind of post-violence power dynamics have been rebuilt or changing. But sadly, the situation also is, as I notice in sociology itself, discipline of sociology, that if you go to the early sociologists, those whom we call as founding fathers of sociology, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, the question of power dynamics, the question of power relationships was very, very central to their study of the society. Today, it seems to be that because of influence of various different kinds of sociological practices, also emerging influence of a stream of anthropology and so on, that there is a turn towards, studying culture, but minus its political dynamics. Minus is its relationships of domination, subordination. It is an incomplete understanding of the society. You wish to produce a kind of a study which is product of wishful thinking, which does not really exist. I was told in one of the comments that you're talking about minority, you're creating divisions in the society. Let's talk about solidarities. But the solidarities cannot emerge without addressing these questions. If you, without addressing these questions, we want to build a solidarity, it will be an imposed solidarity which will not last for long. It will continue to reproduce these kinds of relationships. So anyways, we need to also take the stream of political sociology seriously, is another message which comes from this book, apart from various different specific questions which it
इंडिया का प्लूरलिज्म है या जो प्लूरल सोसाइटी है, उस सिलसिले में ये तो आपका सवाल है कि ये चीज़ें बैक वक्त कैसे कोलैप्स हो गई है, लेकिन एक डिफरेंट पर्सपेक्टिव है जो जलालुल हक अपनी किताब में पेश करते हैं. जलालुल हक, मिथ ऑफ टॉलरेंस उनकी बुक है, जिसमें वो ये तज्जिया करते हैं कि जो टॉलरेंट सोसाइटी का या एंशियंट ग्लोरिफिकेशन जो हमारे सामने किया जाता है वो एक मिथ है. ये सब चीज़ें इनहेरेंट है. तो क्या ये चीज़ें कुछ वक्त के लिए दब गई थी और वक्त गुज़रने के बाद जैसे कॉलोनियल पीरियड में हमने देखा कि ब्रिटिशर्स ने इन डिफरेंसेस को अपने मुताबिक इस्तेमाल किया डिवाइड एंड रूल पॉलिसी के तहत, उसी तरह ये जो इस्टेब्लिशमेंट है ये उसे इस्तेमाल कर रहा है. तो आप इस ज़िमन में क्या सोचते हैं?
नहीं, देखिए, हर समाज में एलिमेंट्स ऑफ टॉलरेंस और एलिमेंट्स ऑफ इंटॉलरेंस दोनों होते हैं। ये सभी फेथ में भी होगा। देयर आर हिस्ट्रीज ऑफ वायलेंस, देयर आर आल्सो हिस्ट्रीज ऑफ नॉन वायलेंस, ऑफ टॉलरेशन वगैरह वगैरह। अब ये डिपेंड करता है कि आपकी प्रायोरिटी क्या है, आप किसके ऊपर अपनी राजनीति बिल्ड करना चाहते हैं, पॉलिटिक्स बिल्ड करना चाहते हैं, एंड हाउ द नेशनल पब्लिक, आई कम बैक टू दैट थिंग, is constituted, how it approves of that, that kind of politics. आज की डेट में डेफिनेटली जो मिजाज है, जो तेवर है इस नेशनल पब्लिक का, वो दैट इज इन सपोर्टिव ऑफ द पॉलिटिक्स व्हिच वी सी अराउंड. However, there have also been situations of non-violence coexistence. In fact, if we really have to document the history of violence, episodes of massive violence are far lesser than the episodes of coexistence. So इसलिए जैसे if you take the example of, and this is built into our society, our economy itself. That is one of the chapters in this book on which I did not elaborate much, is about this whole thing about how the cow has come to be, the politics around the cow. Since the coming of this regime, the law has been revisited, नए लॉ बनाए गए हैं या पुराने लॉ को और भी जो है कड़े बड़ा किए गए हैं. तो एक गुजरात का एक्ट है, पुराना था, जिसमें कि इट वाज cattle of some age, certain age, were allowed for slaughtering. खास करके जब वो अनइकोनॉमिकल हो जाते हैं तो उसके बाद उनको इट वाज अलाउड टू बी स्लॉटर्ड. इसमें दोनों चीज़ थी कि एक तो ठीक है, डिस्पाइट बीइंग अ सेक्युलर स्टेट, द लॉ वाज टेकिंग इनटू अकाउंट द beliefs etc of the majority community, at the same time allowing those whose livelihood depended on this कि वो भी आपका चलता रहे. Now in recent times the state government changed the law. Total ban on all kind of slaughters of all kind of cattle, irrespective of whether cow or buffalo, of all ages. Now this went to the High Court. The High Court around I think in 2000 or so or something, the High Court actually did not allow this new law to be promulgated. बोले कि इसमें जो ये अनकॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल, अल्ट्रा वायर्स कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन है, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में ये रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं. So livelihood should also be allowed. But then they went to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court upheld it, जो न्यू चेंजेस आए थे. और उन्होंने कहा कि पहले 1958 में भी एक केस था बिहार में, जब काउ स्लॉटर बैन हुआ था, तब सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने अलाउ किया था कि सर्टेन एज के काउज एक्सेट्रा को वी कैन अलाउ. एंड पर अब जो है द सुप्रीम कोर्ट चेंज इट्स ओन अर्लियर डिसीजन, सेइंग कि उस वक्त की ग्राउंड रियलिटी कुछ और थी. पहले जो है काउ आफ्टर सर्टेन एज वाज अनइकोनॉमिक, पर अब वो ऐसा नहीं है. अब जो है वो इवन मरने के बाद भी उसका इकोनॉमिक वर्थ है, और उसका जो है स्किन का भी यूज़ होता है, इसका भी बोन्स का भी यूज़ होता है वगैरह वगैरह. तो इसलिए वी कैन नॉट अलाउ इट टू हैपन एट ऑल. So basically it took the excuse of secular logic to impose a religion. Now interesting thing about cow is थोड़ा सा लंबा आंसर है, but just to answer your question about this, tolerance. The whole cow economy is built around interdependence. So even if Muslims are accused of being beef eaters, or beef, or of running slaughterhouses or trading in cow flesh, but सच्चाई इसके अलग है. Beef eaters are not just poor Muslims, but also poor sections of non-Muslims. The traders of the flesh are not just Muslim Qurayshis, Kasabs or Kasais, but also in certain areas you will see the Hindu khatiks, Kanpur वगैरह, वो भी इस trade में involved, traditionally involved. In fact, historically people argue that the Kasabs and the Kasais of that region actually converted from khatiks into Islam. That is one dimension. Those who rear cows, जो गौ पालन करते हैं, वो different castes है. Amongst in North India, Yadavas are associated with that, largely Yadav caste के लोग, and those who are, they are predominantly Muslim Hindus. पर in Mewat region में या कई जगह cow rearing communities are also Muslim, है ना? And they also, for them too, the cow is as important as the other ways. The big slaughterhouses are owned by entirely non-Muslims, which do like meat export, etc. The tanneries in Kanpur and many regions are owned by who do leather work, are associated with Muslims as well as non-Muslims. There is this kind of an interdependence, wherein when a cow, is reared by a farmer, largely of a Yadava community, but when and they might also be involved in the milk trade. But after a while, when the cow stops yielding milk, over age हो जाती है, तो वही फार्मर जो है उसको फार्मर एनिमल मार्केट में जाके बेच आता है, और वो अल्टीमेटली स्लॉटर हाउस में ही एंड अप करती है. Because of this total ban, what happened that not only Muslims lost their livelihoods, the farmers who were rearing cows also found it uneconomical to rear cows. So there is an interesting data now. सेंसस आजकल बैन कर दिया गया है, नहीं हो रहा है. उसके रीजन कोई कुछ नहीं देता, पर नहीं हो रहा, बस नहीं हो रहा. पर एनिमल सेंसस 2019 में हुआ, और एनिमल सेंसस से भी ये पता चला कि काउ पॉपुलेशन एक्चुअली हैज डिक्लाइंड, whereas the population of other cattle which have not been banned has increased. The researchers who have been studying it, they argue that the reason for the decline in the cow population is because the cow has become uneconomical for those who are rearing it. अब वो क्या करेंगे, पहले 15-20 हज़ार रुपये फेच करते थे, but it doesn't make sense to them to now actually rear cow and intend to milk trade, and then what do they do with the uneconomical ones? आप कार खरीदते हैं, पुरानी हो जाती, बेच देते हैं, उसके कुछ पैसे मिलते हैं, नहीं ले आते हैं. अब वो अगर बंद हो जाए तो अब कार के जो ट्रेड है उस पर भी असर पड़ेगा, नई कार के ट्रेड को. And that is exactly what has happened. So rather than improving or increasing the number of cows or protecting cow protection, what these laws have resulted in is in a declining population of cows. This is what happens when politics of frenzy and hate takes over rational thinking. That is what. Yeah.
So my question is कि making Muslim untouchable under a state protection by dehumanizing their identity and culture practice in their daily activity life in the name of love jihad, land jihad, and loyalty with the nations, to reproducing a social fabric just as documented Brahmin and Dalit relation in Manu Smriti. So how do you see? And my question is another related to Article 14. Ki in Article 14, ki you are equal before the law. So what I understand through judicial practices, ki we are equal before the law is conditional. Conditional is कि your status, socio-economic status is equally status before the civil society, then then your Article 14 will be equally before the law. So what is your take on these two questions?
The question, what I could gather, is that how Muslims are being made untouchables now.
Yes, sir.
I don't argue on those lines. I argue that there is section amongst the Muslims who have similar kind of traditional occupation as those of Hindu untouchables, quote unquote, former untouchables, but they are denied that kind of a status. और उसके association में जो benefits आ सकते थे, such as scheduled caste reservation वगैरह, it's being denied solely on account of them being practitioners of Christianity or Islam. But the point which you are making is an argument which now Jan Bremen and Ghanshyam Shah in the case of Gujarat have forwarded. उनकी किताब है इस पे आई है, and they actually are arguing that how Muslims as a category in Gujarat are being turned into untouchables. They are being, denied residency in areas, mixed colonies or quote unquote mixed colonies. They are denied, they're pushed out of economy in that sense. So there is a process of that kind on, which has been noticed by very senior social scientists, and we cannot deny that altogether. However, one can see it in different ways. Equality before law is a constitutional promise. But with the same question, practitioners of Islam, but with their origins in this quote-unquote untouchable caste, went to the courts. That saying that my right to freedom of religion is being infringed upon because of these requirements. If I like KP Manu, if I go back to Hinduism, then you will let me have the benefits of scheduled caste reservation. But if I remain a practitioner of Christianity or Islam, you will deny. So this is an infringement of my freedom of religion. I can't freely choose my religion. But when it comes to these central questions about the ideas around which Indian nationalism is built, that is where this court falters. You may get reprieve on smaller questions, etc. But when it comes to these kind of questions which have far-reaching importance, that is where the courts, as we have observed, have ended up upholding the majoritarian tendencies within the Indian nationalism.
Yes, I have two quick questions, and one question actually you have received online that I will read to you.
Okay.
So, just a couple of days back, there was a huge, advertisement in newspaper with a picture of Yogi Adityanath, and there was a claim that this much of economy or the investment we are reaching to. Now the question actually arises is that we claim on the one side that we are a neoliberal state, and this is something that is we are observing. how this neoliberal state is actually, putting itself in sync with the emergence of the rightist state, what you are calling that the national public has emerged. But the neoliberalism, we know that it requires order and then rationality, also this and that. That is one thing. And so why, they are coexisting. The second thing, I mean, many of your case studies that you have mentioned in your book are very recent one. Could you examine the role of the new technologies in terms of creating this impunity or solidifying these stereotypes or amplifying them further through new data things which are emerging? And the one question actually I received for you on WhatsApp, he's Professor Mazhar Hussain from JNU. He has actually asked whether you have discussed this Parda observance protest by girls in Karnataka or Maharashtra. So
not in this book, but it is in somewhere else. So the first question is about the relationship between neoliberalism and rise of majoritarianism. In this book, I don't really go into that kind of a connect, but I will not say that that connect is not there. However, if we examine historically, neoliberalism is generally traced with 1991 onwards, when we decided to become a free economy, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister, Narasimha Rao, etc. But the rise of Hindutva or the tendencies of Hindu majoritarianism within our nationalist discourse has a longer history. In fact, it goes into the origins of the Indian nationalist idea itself. And here I'm not sparing even a secular nationalist. They might differ only in terms of degree, But this idea that there are certain religions as Indic and there are certain religions as non-Indic almost, pervades the thought of the entirety of the nationalist thinkers in India. Take anyone, Nehru or Patel or anyone else. So, the one is that presence of that ideology and its influence is old. It prospered during colonial times and also in the post-colonial times. But however, the creation or emergence of this kind of a national public, which I am personally referring to, is also associated with the expansion of the new middle class, post-neoliberalism. And historically, wherever the middle class, has emerged, which is called the new middle class, the old middle class was more, defined by government jobs or older kinds of occupations, professions, etc. But the new middle class is entirely dependent on the market and the market associated kind of a professions. Market is also extremely you can say a very uncertain kind of a space. Sometimes the market growth could be huge, and you become really very prosperous in very short time. I see young people nowadays, very much involved in trading, online trading. Everyone is now interested in becoming rich and wealthy as fast as they can. And the ideals are the Ambanis, the Adanis, and the Elon Musk, and so on. Every one of them have those kind of stories that they became rich through the market, from rags to riches, kind of a thing. But the logic of the market is only some can become rich, the rest have to become poorer. for the market really to. That's how it works. So this uncertainty in the market also has created a huge kinds of anxieties, and as a result, the nationalism of the new middle class has these kinds of built-in, hatred, built-in crisis, and they're constantly looking for scapegoats. So in the Indian context, the Muslim becomes the scapegoat. In Europe, the immigrants become the scapegoat. So that is how one can see this association. The second association you may say is direct, that how the corporate interest and Hindu nationalism has grown, and it has now been far more evident the way in which, particularly this kind of a regime has gone all out in favor of certain corporate groups, and relied hugely on donations and mass circulation of money, etc. And your question about, which comes from Professor Mazhar, who said about hijab and all.
Yes.
So it's not in this book, but I have a different essay which came out in a book edited by G. Arunima and Yasser Arafat. G. Arunima is in JNU and Yasser Arafat is in Delhi University, and they came out with a book titled The Hijab, in which I have tried to make a distinction between toleration and tolerance. What I actually argue is that tolerance might be a certain kind of a concession by the majority towards the minority, but toleration is a matter of right. It is constitutionally built in. And by toleration, what it implies is that if you tolerate that which is otherwise most unacceptable to you, that is the test of tolerance. If you tolerate only those things which are from which you have only minor difference, is not tolerance. So toleration, actually, if it is a matter of right, you tolerate that which is most unacceptable to you for whatever reason, but despite that, you tolerate it. But however, at the same time, there is another test which is associated with it. Now, immediately you may come up with a question that, can we then tolerate most reprehensible practices? For example, someone is beating wife, is it tolerable? So people always have a counter question like this, or caste practices are there, should we tolerate? So there is another test associated with it, is of course is what is called the no harm principle. As long as a practice is not doing any real harm to you, I'm not talking about emotional harm. You can say it has hurt my sentiments or something. Real physical harm, if any practice is not doing to you, there is no reason why it should be proscribed or banned by the state. So hijab, for instance, wearing a hijab and going to school is not harming anyone. If at all, it is helping a population which is still probably caught in this thing about tradition, etc., to send its children to the school. Some people have a problem with segregated schooling, like boys' school separate, girls' school separate. But at the same time, one cannot deny the fact that these separate schools have also allowed communities which are very apprehensive about mixing of sexes to let their wards, particularly girls, to study and get educated, which helped hugely. So by banning that, by banning it, you are forcing a kind of a choice to be made, which is not a choice at all, to be made by those people between, say, religion or the practice which we really believe in, which they have learned it and they are not ready to leave it, and between seeking education. Why should we put anyone into this kind of a choice situation? Education should be facilitated. If we really believe that modern education is important, should be facilitated in whatever ways it can be. That should be the goal. Whether a person is wearing hijab or not is a decision which he may or she may, after education or after getting educated, may be able to decide further, take next step as well. But you can't force it. So that is why I make a distinction between tolerance and toleration. But when you come to beef question, it actually does physical harm, because one, banning of beef, cow slaughter or total slaughter of cattle, etc., pushed millions of people out of livelihood. After it's a directly related. It's a doing physical harm. So that is how I would like to see it.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, many congratulations for bringing this book at this moment, and it gives a lot of courage and energy to new researchers and academicians to work on such issues, specifically in this time and context. So my question is, because you talk about the role of state and law with regard to Muslim marginalizations and violence around Muslims. So whenever I come across any article or a book kind of thing or a discussion, we try to locate the role of Sangh Parivar, RSS, and their political front, that is BJP. And if we look at the idea of India, the custodians of idea of India has ruled for a longer period of time in India. And this is something related to the electoral behavior of Muslims as citizens of India, choosing them that they are the sole custodians. But if I personally feel that they have brutally failed in preserving the idea of India. So how do you see the role of the opposite political parties in failing the idea of India, other than these so-called majoritarian or Hindutva forces, and the electoral behavior of Muslims as voters, choosing them as the custodians?
Because this work is not essentially on electoral politics. However, as I can tell you the way in which I've seen it, and I was referring to it, that this national public which I'm talking about has emerged in the world over a period of time. It has had shifting ideological inclinations, but predominantly its tendencies have been more or less same. And thus, it is not just the regime which is today the BJP and the Hindutva or the Sangh Parivar, but it is we can see inbuilt in the tendencies of many political formations, particularly those which have ruled for longer periods of time. So I wouldn't deny that, but at the same time, I would not uphold or advise identitarianism to grow amongst Muslims or any sections of the margin, because that is self-defeating. By identitarianism, I give the talking Muslims for Muslims alone kind of a politics, because that is not what is the structure of our society, and therefore neither our economy, and it should not be the structure of a polity as well. It is self-defeating because it will push the Muslims further into a corner, an isolated corner, whereas they have to constantly seek new kinds of solidarities. The more important thing is to build those solidarities, to build a politics which is more inclusive rather than exclusive.
Really, it was a wonderful lecture, and I have seen that book also. Sir, I want to ask one thing: that people converting from the Dalit background to Buddhism or the Sikhism or Hinduism, they are getting reservation. Do you support that converting to Christianity or the Muslim? Those who we call the Pasmanda Muslim or Dalit Christian, what we call, they should get reservation or not?
See, that's what the whole argument is, that as I said, ki caste exists amongst all Muslims, all society, all followers of all faiths in India, and it is therefore not something specific to Hinduism. Besides, the ideas of pollution, which is associated with certain kind of traditional occupation. Why the Dalits are seen as untouchables or were seen as untouchables? Because the profession was seen as polluting. So whether they were involved in animal skinning, I forgot to mention that in this whole cow kind of economy, you also have the Dalits there, who are more into the skinning of the animal, or disposing of the carcasses. Anyways, to come to your question. So, if that is the case, then why should we deny them? Now, why is it is denied is because there is an inherent, because see, Buddhism as well as Sikhism both argue that they are anti-caste, egalitarian religions. In fact, they emerged against Brahminical practices. But nevertheless, caste has somehow or the other stayed there as well. And therefore, they have come to argue that we should also be getting reservation. The state has extended reservation to them. So, the same logic, using the same logic that Islam and Christianity do not believe in caste, doesn't hold, because you have allowed other of the similar kind to have those benefits. Where the problem lies is actually this whole idea about Indian nationalism, because that certain religions are, Indic and therefore Hinduistic. Buddhism and Jainism and Sikhism are seen as, if not Hinduistic religions. Whereas Christianity and Islam are seen as Abrahamic and foreign religions. And even if people may convert in and out within Hinduistic religion, is to a certain extent acceptable, but not acceptable otherwise. So there is what I sense the problem lies. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain why this is, despite so much of litigation, so many people arguing for it, and there is no logic as to sustain it anymore.